Where is the money in the communities? So we got to this module and immediately into the pool with our heads. There are three main areas where money comes from in communities, or with what money you can create and develop a community. The first is, of course, the direct revenue of the community itself, if we conduct some kind of external activity. The second is when we use some budget expenditure item for community development. For example, in the case of internal communities, these are also charm budgets. In the case of client communities, these are marketing budgets. In other words, in the interests of which department we are creating this community, there and collect the entire chain of interconnection and claim a certain item of expenditure. Here I must say right away that companies often assume that if we are talking about an item of expenditure, then these are necessarily incredibly large amounts. In fact, the topic community is unique, that it is possible to create almost everything with the help of participants, through the involvement of participants, and sometimes it can just mean betting on a community manager. Of course, if we want to hold some kind of client events or large events for community members, then significant budgets will appear, expenditure items will appear, but nevertheless, it is still more often profitable. Let's talk about a few examples a little further. And the third way is external sources of financing. We will also analyze a few in this lesson. Let's talk about the pros and cons. And my main thesis for this lesson is that any community should have three legs at the stool, that is, at least three ways in which it is monetized or three ways in which we generate revenue. For clubs, these are most often membership fees, an agency model, and payment for individual events. Well, let's go now to analyze each of the options in more detail. Let's sort out the revenue by the bones, from which monetization formats it can generally be formed. And let's talk about the pros and cons of each of them. I will go from the most popular, the most frequently used, to those that are used less often or give the least revenue. So, the first and most popular for the community market is still membership fees. Membership fees, we mean the amount that a person pays for a certain period of time. This is a tangible amount that he feels and decides to pay. As a rule, we do not recommend making membership fees for less than 3 months, but it is better to immediately make membership fees for a year, giving the opportunity to divide into 3-month quarters. But about the pros and cons a little later. The second most common one is the payment for individual events. This format also has its advantages and disadvantages, and we will talk about them, as well as about life hacks, how to level out the disadvantages. The third way to generate revenue and a growing trend is subscriptions. But about subscriptions, perhaps I will land many of you, because in many ways it is a hyping tool, but it does not give the financial result that you would like. I will tell you about the pros and cons, and when you can use a subscription, and when you should not use it. The fourth way is donates. Everything that concerns the online community and some kind of emotional sports communities. This method is also growing. We will analyze its pros and cons, and it does not lose its relevance. This is an advertising model or a sponsorship model. This is when we sell specifically the coverage of our community, and an advertiser comes to us. He pays us for those coverage or engagement, or the number of surfaces on which we place it in our community. This model, especially the last few years, has had such a fat minus. About him a little further. The sixth way is the agent model. The agent model, or it is also called transactional, is when someone from our community buys something from others, and we receive an agency fee for it. There are cases when I highly recommend using it, and it can give a significant increase in the company's revenue, and there are cases when it only distracts and reduces trust in the community. Be sure to pay attention to this later in the lesson. The seventh is digital goods. If we are talking about gaming communities, then this is a significant share. For example, buy yourself some kind of stuff about upgrading a character, and so on. If we are talking on average about communities, clubs, and so on, then this is a very rare element. That is, when we can sell some digital element. If we talk about communities now, then this is some status inside the chat. For example, maybe at one time, when crypto projects were hyped, this is a certain status in the community, which opens up new opportunities for you in the digital part, and so on. But nevertheless, this is still a fairly rare way of real monetization now. And the eighth way is when we put forward a project and tell the crowd to chip in as much as they can. This is crowdfunding, and it also takes place, although quite rarely. Let's analyze the sources of the budget. As I have already said, it can be a marketing budget if we build client communities. If we build a community that affects the client's NPC, funnel, conversion, and so on, then it can be a marketing budget. Well, for example, let's give some brand of sportswear, women's make a community, and it lies in their marketing articles. If we build an internal community or, for example, an external community but aimed at attracting, for example, programmers or some other its specialties, and, for example, we create a community in which programmers communicate, and then we hire them to ourselves, then this may well be our article for hiring. And in the case of building communities, hiring from the community will always be cheaper than hiring just from the street. In addition, communities are often created on articles from charitable expenses. Big companies are also laying on this, and some versions of communities are created from them. If we talk about external sources of financing, then I will probably name them more in the format of a transfer. In order to expand your understanding, we will not go deep into studying them, because each of them is directly a separate subject that is taught in universities or in specialties. So, the first one is everything that concerns state national projects, grants. When something in the state is chosen as priorities develops, a lot of support tools appear for it, and then you can apply for them, meeting some criteria. The second is to attract investment. For example, if we are making some kind of application, or we are creating some, for example, a patient community, then we can attract investments from interested organizations or funds. Fundraising is a tool that involves collecting budgets on completely different conditions. This is often used in the eco agenda, for example, in healthcare, and so on. Well, in this part of the lesson, let's talk about the pros and cons of each of the frequent models. Let's start with the membership fees. A huge plus of this format is that you immediately have the amount that you can dispose of, especially if these are membership fees, which are immediately for a year in advance. The main disadvantage of this format is that in the second year, there is often a high outflow. We will analyze how to prevent this outflow in the marketing and sales in communities module, so be sure to take a look. But another big disadvantage of those who come to the community and enter this model is that they are inattentive and spend money that was received a year in advance in the first months. Therefore, my first caution is, if you enter the membership fee model, then be sure to immediately calculate the monthly budget of your club or community in such a way that in the first month, the second month, or the third month, you spend only 1/12 of the membership fee the number of participants at the moment. The peculiarity of the model with membership fees is that in order to scale it and develop it systematically in general, of course, it is necessary to build a sales department. Membership fees on self-payments are an illusion, a myth, and an exception confirming the rule. Payment for individual events. But the huge advantage is that this method gives variability. Well, for example, you can start with it when you think whether you want to enter the community market at all or not. In general, this is an activity for you or not. And then you just assign some payments for the first events. If there is already an existing community, then paying for individual events allows you to take out highly variable expenses. For example, the costs of meetings. They can vary greatly depending on the place in a separate article. When a participant pays an organizational fee for a meeting separately from membership fees. Actually, the main disadvantage of this model for events is that every time the organizer understands me now, everyone on the other side will understand, until the last one sits and turns gray with each event, because he does not understand whether it will pay off or not. Almost always, the understanding of the payback of exits plus for the event comes the last 14 to 10 days before the end of the event. This means that, as a maximum, all prepayments are made by the organizer himself. At the very least, that he is stressed to the last about whether or not he will gain the required number of participants. Subscription model. Its main advantage is that it can be automated and it does not require a sales department. By subscription, we mean automatic payments, recurring payments that are debited themselves. And the subscription model needs strong marketing, and there may not be a sales department. And this is a huge advantage because, of course, the sales department for clubs and communities is often a pain. But here it is important for me to warn. Often novice community organizers make a subscription model with a low check, but sales managers put them to sell. And some manager collects these 3,000 rubles from this participant every month. First of all, such a sales manager who collects 3,000 rubles will never pay off just his salary. And secondly, a member of the community that you drive into the stress of making decisions every month whether he needs to pay further. This is a model with a very short TV, that is, the duration of participants in the community. Therefore, this model, in my expert opinion, takes place only in one case, if you have a large base and strong marketing competencies in the team, so that you can build a funnel in such a way that it is auto payments and that it is a large enough base that doing certain actions with a small check, and a subscription is always a small check, in the end, it still turned out to be a big figure. The next model is donates. Donations are a model that is usually used as an additional one, even if it seems to you that some bloggers or some communities use donations as the main model, then in the form of Podkapotny, there are usually no figures. After all, for big artists or sports players or something else about this topic, where donations arise, the main article of revenue generation is nevertheless different. As a rule, these are advertising and advertising contracts, and donates are an auxiliary story. I also recommend that other communities also consider the donation system for themselves as auxiliary, especially when it is some viral topics affecting emotions or very bright ideas. The disadvantage of donating is that it implies the presence of competence in a team that can ensure the seamless nature of these payments. If you are not on some platform, well, for example, you live in a VC where all these technical payment modules are already built in, and you want to make donates through some of your service, then this should all it can be very seamless, because a person wants to throw this donation in one click. And this is where seamless is very important. In order for there to be donations, it must be right in one click. Therefore, the presence of such a specialist in the team who knows how to build it is a critical element for using this model. The next one is an advertising sponsorship model. What is its advantage? Its advantage is that by holding the same event, you can simply make this event much more marginal by attracting advertisers or sponsors, because there are usually not so many additional costs associated with attracting advertisers. Well, that is, you print banners anyway, or you have a screensaver there anyway. You just place the logos of advertisers on it. This is a huge advantage of this format. I highly recommend adding it as an additional model to everyone who has large reach, where you may be interesting to advertisers, or small, but with a very solvent target audience. A noticeable disadvantage of this model is that you need to hire a separate advertising manager who knows how to attract these sponsorship and advertising budgets. Because it's just like that to hold events, to expect advertisers to line up for you, of course this does not happen. Well, the second drawback of this model is why I never recommend taking it as the main one for communities, because advertising budgets are reduced in the first place. As soon as something is shaken, first of all, articles of such integrations are reduced, and not some kind of performance marketing. The agency model is good in two cases, or if you have a very large reach and generally attendance of some service, and you can recommend many different additional complementary services to your community, receiving an agency fee for this. In this case, it is critically important that these payments are automatic and transparent for you, so that you do not run after each service, asking for your 10,000 rubles or 100,000 rubles to transfer to you on the account there, and so on. The second case is when this model is good, when you have a very solvent audience. For example, in a club, let's give an example. An investment fund can come to some club and buy out a series of investment business breakfasts, paying not only for this grid, for example, events, but also for every transaction within this club. Or, for example, If a yacht seller integrates into your club, he can pay you a significant agency commission for each transaction. That is, where there is a large check and a target audience in your community that is able to master this large person. There are models for very creative integrations that allow, without losing face, to create an additional revenue item and often tangible. There can only be one disadvantage of such a model, which is that it is very difficult to keep this reputational edge for a paying audience between when you are engaged in commercial integrations. Therefore, take a closer look here. The method of monetization is digital goods. As I have already said, this is a great tool because it has a very high profitability, and in some communities, this is the main model of monetization. For most of those who watch this lesson, it will not be the main one, but it may be such a chip. For example, Telegram chat has a limited number of signatures that participants can have. These signatures, for example, are also essentially digital goods that you can sell for something by some resident. The disadvantage of this monetization model is that, as I have already said, it works either in a very small number of pieces, if we are talking about an ordinary community, or in large numbers, if we are talking about platforms or applications, and so on. Crowdfunding is a model when we post a project that we describe on special platforms or in our public domain and begin to raise funds for it. Moreover, these amounts can be regulated, that is, well, specifically, we issue several checks there, or it can be an open check for any amount. It can be like securing some goods for the amount deposited, or just the amount deposited, so that something is built. In other words, a direct transfer is when we collect money from the crowd. The advantage of this option is that it has a very high profitability. The downside is that this is often an unpredictable result. In other words, whether we hooked on ideas, whether we created some kind of viral effect to which a person responded to pay. This is always such an unpredictable game for community creators. Now let's move on to the budgeting block. Let's also look at some of the pros and cons of these scenarios. Of course, there are huge advantages of the budgeting format in general when we do not sell something to the community user, but budget from our expenses. This is because you don't think about sales and can fully concentrate on products. Because everyone who makes commercial communities, they understand that they always have these two big pains in their head: how to sell and how to make a product. But in the case of budgeting, you just have only one such good idea at all: the product. Well, and somewhere to report for budgets and protect this budget once a year. The disadvantage of this format is that, of course, once a year, you have to defend the budget, and this means proving the net effect. But are you sure that it was the community that influenced this metric, and so on? Here I'll throw in a few life hacks for you that you can use. First, always freeze the cohort. For example, we say we are an internal community, a community of employees influence retention. And he says to us, but prove that it was you who influenced the retention, and not the change of something. We say, okay, we take a cohort of those who are inside our community. We take a cohort of those who are not in the community and measure this metric. And as a rule, if you do your job well, then in a cohort where there is a community, any metric engagement, loyalty, retention, it will be higher. And one more thing that can be used is to use not only direct expenses, but also lost profits. For example, when the company floors came and calculated the cost of building a community and what budget they can manage. If they want to build a community of realtors, they look not only at how much it costs to attract a realtor, but also at how much they could get on average if these realtors were retained and not they left the company. Therefore, we look not only at direct expenses, but also at potential lost profits and operate with figures. Whenever we want to protect the budget, we must appeal to some figure that we will influence. I will briefly comment on external sources of attraction. Their huge plus is that you can get a lot of money at a time. Well, for example, if we have attracted investments, then we cannot think about raising funds, revenue, and so on for a year and a half. The downside is that, of course, in order to attract this large amount, you have to stomp. The most important disadvantage, since I have seen a lot of such projects, when you have attracted someone's subsidy, someone's investment, some kind of grant, for the interests of matching the speed of grant execution, reporting on subsidies, the interests of investors. Often you have to end up doing absolutely not what you were going to do, but adjust under the vector of what kind of money has entered you. Anyone who has worked with large projects and with large customers or with large subsidies has now more than understood. We looked at where the money is in the communities. By completing the tasks for this module, and after that we will move on to marketing and selling our community. Even if it's free, you need to watch this module about marketing and sales.